Okay, so now the introduction to Deuteronomy as Moses' final words. While the whole book of Deuteronomy in the Old Testament presents itself as Moses' last words to God's people, allowing a second reading of the law, which is the literal meaning of Deuteronomy, it's clear that Deuteronomy, in fact, dates from long after Moses' death, probably during or just after the exile in Babylon. And the gut-wrenching question that lies behind every verse in Deuteronomy and in the hearts of every single one of God's people at that time is, what do God's people have when they've lost what they previously had considered the bedrock of their identity? In other words, what's left when you've lost the king, the kingdom, the land, and the temple? But let's make sure we understand this. From the time of Abraham and Sarah, God's people had been promised land. As they understood it, God gave them the land of Canaan, and as many claim to this day, God gave that to them permanently and perpetually. Then, under King David, God had further promised or covenanted a Davidic king and, quote, house. Now, house understood both as a kingdom and a temple. This covenant was also understood as being both permanent and perpetual. However, in a series of foreign invasions, first by the Assyrians, who captured the northern kingdom, and then 200 years later when the Babylonians invaded and then destroyed the temple, sending the king and court into exile, all seemed lost. And the gut-wrenching questions people had to ask themselves was, what happened? Had their God not been powerful enough to keep God's covenant and promises? How could God's people remain God's people when their chief sources of identity, land, king, kingdom, and temple, had all been lost? The final book of Torah, the one we know today as Deuteronomy, answers those questions by presenting the entire book as Moses' final speech before God's people enter the land. In it, Moses gives a recapitulation of the law, a second telling, which, if carefully compared with earlier parts of Torah, is actually a re-editing of it. And in this re-editing comes the answer people are straining to hear hundreds of years later at the time of the exile, or soon after their return. What do God's people have when they don't have land, king, kingdom, and temple? They have the law, Torah, God's teaching, instruction, and ordinances. So now, let's turn to the epitome of Moses' last words in Deuteronomy, chapter 30, verses 11 to 20.